Yutika ji, you can begin.
Okay, thank you. Namaskar, good afternoon to everyone. I welcome you all to this program on the past presidents of All India Women's Conference. This is a program where we, go back into the memory lane and we try to look at our past presidents, the great ladies that they were, their contributions, their efforts, how they came out of their comfort zone and did the very extraordinary things that we even today we fail to even imagine. That's the way the All India Women's Conference presidents were, and we are always trying to follow them, we are trying to emulate them, we are trying to get our inspiration from them. And this is one of the programs thought of, conceptualized by our current president, Mrs. Sheila Kakade. And she is behind all this, and she's been inspiring and motivating everyone. All the branches are involved. And one of the good things that we can now see, and those who have joined just now for the first time, we have built up a huge collection now. It's building up. And by the time we come to our later, the current presidents, we'll have a huge collection of material which is research worthy. People can come and consult that material, because the ladies that we are talking of were not just AIWC presidents. They were also freedom fighters. They were intellectuals, philosophers. They were public figures in their own right. So I take pleasure. I'm Dr. Yutika Mishra. I take pleasure in introducing them. Today we are going to talk about the 15th president, Mrs. Rameshwari Nehru, and the 16th president, Mrs. Vijaylakshmi Pandit. So here, guys, welcome to this session, our ode to past presidents. Before we start, and I must tell you, we have a great gathering today, illustrious speakers. So before we start, I would request our President, Sheila ji, for your presidential address. Sheila ji, over to you.
Namaskar to all my dear sisters, young and old, and the guests who have joined in today's webinar, taking us on the virtual journey with All India Women's Conference in its teens, 14th year and 15th year of our existence, along with the dynamic presidents, Srimati Rameshwari Nehru and Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit. Our 15th president, Srimati Rameshwari Nehru, was born in Lahore. She came from a very orthodox family where Parda system was prevalent and it was observed very strictly. Having been denied formal education, Rameshwari Nehru was able to make up a deep mark in the history by her relentless efforts to bring about the emancipation of women. We have Shweta Rai Talwar, our Assistant Secretary, to give detail about her work for the community and AIWC. We also have Shri Ashokji Nehru, her grandson, in conversation with Professor Neera Mishra and Professor Kamlesh Mohan from Chandigarh University to put light on her life. Our 16th president in 1942-43, Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit was the first woman to be elected President of the United Nations General Assembly in 1953. A prominent politician and active Indian nationalist, she was also the first Indian woman to hold a cabinet position in pre-independent India. As newly independent India's top diplomat, Srimati Pandit served as ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1947-49, the United States and Mexico 1949-51, Ireland in 1955-61, and Spain 1958-61, and High Commissioner to the United Kingdom 1955-61. In 1979, she was appointed India's representative to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. Member in charge of our in-house magazine Roshni, Srimati Chitra Sarkar, along with Srimati Gita Segal, Srimati Pandit's granddaughter, and Dr. Karan Singh, former head of the state, will highlight the different aspects of Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit's life. I appreciate the efforts put in by Srimati Sudha Acharya, our permanent representative at the United Nations, and her assistant daughter Navina for getting Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit's presidential address at the United Nations General Assembly in 1953 and her pictures from the United Nations archives. Thank you very much, dear Sudha and Navina. For the benefit of our guests today, I take the opportunity to tell a few lines about AIWC. All India Women's Conference is a 94 years old national organization established in 1927 by Sarojini Naidu, Margaret Cousins, Dr. Annie Besant, with Maharani Chumnabai Gaikwad II of Baroda as the first president and Kamladevi Chattopadhyay as the first secretary, having its head office at 6 Bhagwan Das Road, New Delhi now. The education and the position of women in British India needed a lot to be improved, and the formation of a community of women to work towards improving the status of women was a need of the hour. Chosen representatives of these conferences all over India attended a formal conference in Pune on 6 January 1927 and later in Delhi, and women and girls from all classes and creed were encouraged to avoid child or early marriage and to get formally educated. Women of stature, such as Viceroy of India, Lady Irwin, Vijaylakshmi Pandit, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Srimati Rameshwari Nehru, Lady Rama Rao, Maharanis of Bhopal and Travancore, Muthulakshmi Reddy, Hansa Mehta, to name a few, were the stalwarts of this illustrious organization. AIWC rose further along and gained consultative status of ECOSOC with the United Nations and other international bodies like International Alliance for Women, Pan-Pacific South Asian Women's Association, REN, Infosay, etc. Many institutions like the Lady Irwin College, New Delhi, Cancer Institute, Chennai, Family Planning Association of India, Amrit Kaur Institute for Mentally Challenged Children, Old Age Home at Vrindavan are few among many others pioneered by AIWC, which are now autonomous bodies in India. All India Women's Conference also brought upon many legislative reforms in India, including the Universal Adult Franchise, Hindu Code Bill, Maternity Benefits Act, Sharda Act, etc. AIWC at its own level runs projects and programs implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. Regular creche programs are also run in the branches. Many branches are running primary schools, working women's hostels. IRWC also runs short stay homes at Vrindavan at head office. Besides this, 10 more branches also run program for distressed women. Our three trusts for education, health, senior citizens also run separate programs. National integration and communal harmony are being offered as programs to AIWC's vast network of branches, numbering around 500 plus all over India, with membership around a lakh and plus. Other programs conducted are health checkups, anemia programs, socio-economic programs for empowerment, looking at the need of the hour, lot of awareness programs on gender sensitization, sexual harassment and legal awareness, environment and climate change, renewable energy, water and waste management are conducted on virtual platform. During the pandemic, our branch members spread over the country in approximately 500 branches extended their helping hand towards the needy in every form: food, medicines, sanitizers, oxygen cylinders, vaccination support, providing accommodation for medical doctors and paramedicals, etc. AIWC branches have provided counseling to the mentally disturbed in this COVID situation also. Under Environment Protection Program, our branches take up plantation in rainy season. Recently, our South Zone A, comprising of Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu and Pondicherry states, have launched the program of Planet Abundantly Green with the initiative of our Joint Secretary Supriya Bhalerao with the help of Forest Department. I'm sure All of you must be now very eagerly waiting to listen to each one of the speakers. So now I ask our member in charge library, Yutika ji, to move forward. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sheila ji, for telling us about what AIWC stands for. And now let's go back to the memory lane and let's go back a little bit. When AIWC was actually involved in freedom struggle, I believe. All the ladies who were there, they were involved in the freedom struggle also. So that was another struggle that was, being negotiated by the members of AIWC. Now, coming to our program, we have with us our member, AIWC member, Mrs. Shweta Rai Talwar. She is the Assistant Secretary of AIWC. She's going to introduce Mrs. Rameshwari Nehru to us. She's going to talk about Rameshwari Nehru, journey of her life and contribution to AIWC. Shweta ji, over to you.
Thank you so much, Yutika ji. My presentation is audible, is visible?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much.
It is.
Namaskar. A very good afternoon. President Mrs. Sheila Kakre, Secretary General Kuljit Kaur ji, Treasurer Ma'am Rehana Begum ji, our very eminent guests and speakers, members, friends and colleagues. I have the proud privilege of introducing Shrimati Rameshwari Nehru, the 15th President of AIWC in the year 1941-42. I would just like to speak a bit on the journey of her life and her contribution to AIWC. We move on to the first slide. Here we can see Rameshwari ji in different stages of her life. In 1987, a stamp was commemorated for her. More service is demanded of us. More dedication is called for. Work from where you stand, where destiny placed you. Do your best to finish the old world of tyranny and exploitation and lend your helping hand to bring in the new era of peace and goodwill. I quote Shrimati Rameshwari Nehru, popularly called Mataji, the 15th President of the All India Women Conference in the year 1941-42. She was a woman who was a patriot, a philanthropist, a Gandhian with immense personal magnetism and a lot of tolerance and tact in dealing with persons of different shades of opinion. She was born on 10th December 1986 to Raja Narendranath of Lahore. Though from an affluent background, she had no formal education and studied from the governess who came to teach her brother. She, however, blossomed into a versatile personality and an eloquent speaker with strong Gandhian principles. She fought tirelessly for the rights of women, social dignity, economic and political rights of the so-called untouchables, the Harijans. In this picture, we can see Rameshwari ji with the husband, Brijlal Nehru. She was married to Brijlal Nehru, nephew of Motilal Nehru and cousin of Jawaharlal Nehru. She had two sons, Braj Kumar Nehru and Balwant Kumar Nehru. After her marriage, she came to Allahabad and Anand Bhavan, from where she was allowed full freedom and she discarded the parda. She started a Mahila Samiti at a tender age and a Hindi magazine called Istri Darpan in 1909, which she edited for 16 years. These were to awaken the Indian women to the social needs of the hour. Our next speaker, Mrs. Kamlesh Mohan, will talk. Dr. Kamlesh Mohan will talk very deeply on this, on the Istri Darpan and her contribution to women's rights. In this slide, we can see Rameshwari ji at the back with her husband. It was a joint family. And we can see her young Rameshwari ji and a very, very handsome husband. And Jawaharlal Nehru is sitting on the floor. On the right is the governess of the children and of Brijlal Nehru and his wife, her wife Swarup Rani. In this slide, we can see Rameshwari ji's son, B.K. Nehru, and his illustrious wife, who was born in Hungary. Ashok Nehru ji, who's the eldest grandson of Rameshwari ji, is here with us today. These are his parents, and he will throw a lot of light on this later. Coming back to Rameshwari ji, she was the founder and president of the Delhi Women's League in 1926. And to raise the age of child marriage, she fought against caste prejudice also. She inspired many young women to take up social work, and Aruna Asaf Ali was one of them. Aruna was rather lonely and lost in Delhi, where Asaf Ali brought her after marriage. Rameshwari ji befriended her and made her take interest in social reforms and politics. It came to her naturally to build up people's self-confidence. She was appointed on the Age of Consent Committee in 1928 to examine witnesses to ascertain the condition of married life and maternity and the laws relating to the age of consent, child marriage, and other such evils which were brought to the forefront by her. The report published by her was a plea on behalf of the victims of bride custom and usage. In 1930, she went to London and was a part of many committees there. As president of the Women's Committee of the Indian League, Women's Indian Association, etc. Sorry, there's a. She was part of, as president of the Indian Committee of the Indian League, Women's Indian Association, etc. She propagated the cause of Indian women, the Indian National Congress, and the freedom of the country. The League of Nations invited her to Geneva in 1931. She visited Russia and then Australia in 1937. Here we can see Rameshwari ji in London. This is in 1930. In 1930, Gandhiji fasted and courted arrest in Yerwada jail against the British Communal Award, which gave a special separate. Sorry, there's a little bit of a disturbance. Which gave
Supriya, please tell us to mute themselves. Mute themselves.
Kindly mute yourself, all of you. Some of them I am unable to mute from here. Kindly mute yourself all throughout. Thanks.
In 1930, Gandhiji fasted and courted arrest in Yerwada jail against the British Communal Award, which gave a special electorate to Muslims and the untouchables. He had given the untouchables the name of Harijans, children of God, and worked towards giving them equality in education, social and economic upliftment. Because of his protests, the British government decided to withdraw this award, and he now formed a Harijan Sevak Sangh. Rameshwari ji went to Pune and offered her services to Gandhiji. She was made in charge of this work in Punjab. Later, she traveled all over India to Cochin, Travancore, and British Malabar, examining the condition of 17 million socially untouchables, propagating untouchability and the need to throw temples open to the Harijans. She became the Sangh's president. She lived her last years at the Kingsway Harijan colony in Delhi, where she mothered and helped educate Harijan students. Thus, from 1934 onwards, she dedicated herself to the service of the Harijans. And according to Margaret E. Cousins, she was Gandhi's, Margaret E. Cousins is the founder of AIWC. She was Gandhiji's right-hand woman in the Harijan Seva Sangh. Here we can see Rameshwari ji. She's garlanding Mahatma Gandhi. And we can see Sarojini Naidu, Hena Sen, and other ladies with her. In 1942, she was elected the president of All India Women Conference. And she fell head-on into the responsibility and worked for the equality and free education for women and the rights of women in different aspects of their life. The world was full of gloom and under the threat of bombing during this time. Evil customs, unjust laws, early marriage, widow remarriage, abolition of dowry, sati, the Devdasi system, forced child prostitution were pressing issues. The AIWC gave women a definite shape and color to the women's movement, drawing them from various backgrounds and different locations from across the country, linking them and awakening them to their rights. The participation of women in public work was rare at that time, and AIWC and other social religious reform agencies were constantly building the self-esteem and confidence of women. She did a lot of work for the affected victims of the Bengal famine and founded the Children's Aid Society in Lahore. She was serving juvenile institutions in Punjab and recommendations for the care and maintenance of orphan children. She urged upon the Punjab government through press and public meetings for the urgent need of the protection of neglected and delinquent children. Housing for the poor and raising a voice against exploitation from the landlords was advocated by her, as was khadi and charkha, the spinning wheel. In 1945, she was elected unopposed to the British Legislative Assembly from the Lahore Division Women's Constituency. Mahatma Gandhi nominated her the agent for Kasturba Gandhi National Memorial Trust for Punjab and Kashmir, where she organized village workers training camps and centers. She also pressed for the right of the detainees and other prisoners. During the Quit India movement, she quoted arrests intentionally to bring home to the Indian women the need for freedom. She also made a special effort to bring out Kashmiri Pandits and Muslim women in Parda from the restraints of the four walls of their homes. A group of women from the Zenana led a demonstration on horseback. After partition, she helped the refugees in relief and re-inhabitation work. Lajpat Nagar in Delhi housed many such women who had lost their menfolk and had to now fend for themselves. They were trained in sewing, and orders were taken to sew uniforms for the police and embroidery in batches for the army to make them skilled and self-reliant. These women could now earn a salary of rupees 150, which is a very handsome amount of the time. She was a woman who attended to defend a new social order and equality in women and workforce for the country and the nation. In this slide, we can see ma'am during a program at the Kingsway camp with Jawaharlal Nehru and Shri Sevak Ram of Harijan Seva Sangh. 31st January 1948, Gandhiji's assassination. The light has gone out of our lives and there is darkness everywhere, Jawaharlal Nehru said. In this slide, we can see a group of mourners, including Rameshwari ji, Gita Segal, who was 20 years old, daughter of Vijaylakshmi Pandit, and Padmaja Naidu, daughter of Sarojini Naidu. At the picture at the bottom, we can see Pandit Nehru at the gates of Birla House. He was trying to control the mobs, who were really very unrestful. After independence, she was offered many ministerial offices, which she declined. She was totally a grassroots worker and humbly continued her grassroots work for the oppressed and downtrodden, as she was associated with the All India Peace Council, the Afro-Asian Solidarity Movement. She led the delegation for disarmament to Tokyo in 1957 and to Stockholm in 1958. She was awarded the Padma Bhushan in 1955 for the recognition of her services to the country, and she received the Lenin Peace Prize in 1961. Her writings were compiled in a book called Gandhi My Star, which is a referral work on women's movement internationally. I saw this book on the website of the Stanford University. So it is great, really, great, absolutely. In this slide, we can see Mrs. Rameshwari Nehru in Copenhagen at the anniversary celebrations of the International Federation of Democratic Women. This is Gandhi My Star. It's a compilation of Rameshwari Nehruji's speeches. She moved with her husband, Brijlal Nehru, to Harijan Colony, Kingsway Camp, Delhi, where they lived for several years. Until Brijlal's death in 1965, she was a mother figure to Harijan students who were educated and trained there. In 1965, she moved to Washington, D.C. to join her son, Braj Kumar, and his wife, Shobha, at the Indian ambassador's home. In this slide, we can see her with her son and the President Johnson in Washington. Mr. Ashok Nehru, her eldest grandson, will tell us more about this slide. See, with her two sons, the President of USA, I mean, she called him himself her son. So this is very interesting. I think he'll tell us more about it. There she suffered a stroke and was hospitalized, flown to Delhi, where she died in Wellington Hospital on 8 November 1966. I quote from her presidential address of AIWC in the year 1942. "We have no bitterness in our movement. None is likely to come in. All that we want is to establish equality and fair play between the relation of man and woman as well as man and man. That is the only foundation on which a stable structure of civilized society can be built. The extension of non-violence from the individual to the group, its application to national and international matters, is a new experiment with a technique involved by Gandhiji in the laboratory of his life, in which all through he has experimented with truth. The expansion of the scope of the conference, that is All India Women Conference, from merely women's problems to wider questions of human relationships. A living organization needs growth, and no narrow limits for its self-expression are possible. This holds so much truth today in a world which is battling unrest, greed, materialism, disease, and degradation of its environmental and natural resources, and a fight against them. As we would like to remember Rameshwari ji, it is her birthday in 1954, with Vice President Dr. S. Radhakrishnan and her other followers and admirers. And this is another picture of her with Jawaharlal Nehru. And on this note, I end this presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Shweta. That was great. Amazing compilation. So much information here. And you did a great job. And I'm surprised and amazed at how you did your research. You must tell me later. But for now, let's move on with our next speaker, a very illustrious personality with us. She is Professor Kamlesh Mohan. And Professor Mohan, if you, I would like to make you recollect, I met you somewhere in one of the conferences of International Federation for Research on Women's History, maybe in Belfast or in Amsterdam, somewhere. I had a good chat with you. So incidentally, when I looked at the book in our library and your name on it, then I immediately said, nah, this is the person we want for this seminar. Dr. Kamlesh Mohan has a very impressive CV in front of me, and it is amazing how much you have done. She's a well-known writer on nationalism, gender identities, science and technology. Her specific books, which I'd like to mention here, are Militant Nationalism in Punjab and a book on Rameshwari Nehru. They have been translated in English and Hindi also. She is ex-chairperson and professor, Department of History, Punjab University, Chandigarh. As an acknowledgement of her services to the university, she has been appointed as Professor Emeritus in the Department of History in 2018. Having total teaching experience of almost 34 years, including a few years in other Indian universities, she was the first Emeritus Fellow of the UGC and the first visiting professor in Maison de Sciences de l'Homme, Paris, from the Department of History of Punjab University. She was also elected as the Senior Associate Member of St. Anthony's College in Oxford, UK, and was also awarded a British Council Charles Wallace Fellowship and also Agatha Harrison Visiting Fellowship in 1995-96 for a research project on conceptualizing social categories in the colonial writings on Punjab between 1840s and 1940s. Her work goes on and on. Her writings are, 2-3 pages I can go on, and her books and monographs. But in her writings, she has analyzed the nature and working of colonial state and its institutions in the area of politics, gender, science, and technology. Dr. Mohan has published more than 16 books, I think now, and monographs and almost 38 research papers in national and international areas. Moreover, she has a list of grants and fellowships to her credit, and we are very glad you have with us, and we can see that you are, as far as I can remember, you're a member of so many national and international bodies. Maybe I can mention a few, like the Adult Education Association, an organization of Jan Shikshan Sansthan. She's a social activist and has been working in slum areas as a student, and a resource person for preparation of educational material, and associated with Jan Shikshan Sansthan, and this, as I said, this goes on, and we are so fortunate and so lucky that we have you with us, Professor Mohan. And now I would request you to start your talk for today. We are really honored. Thank you. And now I invite Professor Kamlesh Mohan. Over to you, ma'am. You can unmute.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, perfect. Yes, you are very honest.
You're muted, ma'am. You're muted, please.
Is it okay?
Yeah, yes, please.
Now, fine.
Madam Sushila Kakale, the current president of All India Women's Conference, I am grateful to you for inviting me to share my ideas about Rameshwari Nehru ji. And Yuthika Mishra has introduced me in glowing terms, and Shweta Talwar ji has been in constant touch with me for guiding me how to handle technology and these kinds of things. And above all, I'm grateful to my virtual friends whom I can't see, but they have to bear with me. So I would share my ideas about Rameshwari Nehru ji. I would raise this question, why I wrote the biography of Rameshwari Nehru. This is important. The rest of the details, overviews have been given by Shweta Talwarji and the other speakers also. But I thought it's a very important question. Why do we write the biographies? Why do we write the autobiographies of women? Men have been writing their autobiographies to acquaint us with their public life. They hardly mention any women. But women's autobiographies like Reminiscences of Rameshwari Nehru or Vijaylakshmi Panditji's The Scope of Happiness and many other there are, or Amrita Pritam's A Revenue Stamp, etc., etc. So they express themselves or they reveal their perception of themselves, also of the world around them. If they have gone to public life, then about the public life, and also how they view society, how society treats them, so their experiences also. Now the question which I am dealing with right at the outset is, why did I write the biography, or why we write the biographies of women? I was faced with historiographic challenge, how to retrieve women's contribution from observation and write their history. Also, how to reconstruct the social history through the incorporation of male and female visions, and a number of issues are implicated in writing the life stories of prominent women. So I am not going to talk about the role of honor of these dominant women. I'm more interested in their sense of struggle, how they shaped their life, what kind of experiences they had. And the main thing which is important for all of us as women is agency of women. When I say agency, agency means self-perception, worldview, their experiences, whether they had a right to take their own decisions, like education and other things also, and the economic and social area. And also how their agency, how was the historical constitution of their agency was determined by family, clan, religion, and different notions of moral order in society. Second thing which concerns me or which bothered me was women have multiple identities. They are nurturers, they are feminists, they are crusaders for democratic values, human rights, peace, and so on and so forth. And another important thing is that is how the women's personality is constituted and how they are conceptualized in religious texts. How can we reconcile them? real women and the ideal women. This is also an important thing which goes into the making of a biography. And the process of contradiction is may be reflected in the gaps and fissures between the real life identities and the ideal images of women. And third issue which bothered me was whether a woman can act as an evaluative agency. It would depend upon their individual maturity of their individual consciousness and collective consciousness, whether they were aware of themselves as women, as human beings. It would depend on the independence and effectiveness of their voices, which may be manipulated by males, by customs, by family, and also other social political organizations to sustain their power. Surely, implicit evaluation is available to us in folk songs, sayings, and other things also. And Rameshwari Nehru's self-view, self-image is expressed through her journal, which she founded. It is called Istri Darpan in 1909. As its founder, she had created a space for the articulation of the feminist critique of gender relations, perceptions of women, and customs by her readers and contributors in the Hindi belt, and later through the Indian women's movement for political rights and legal rights of women, for urban women also. I don't wish to recover and appropriate the role of honor of independent, rebellious, and pioneer women, which may lead to an simplification of the concept of agency. I found it more useful to retrieve a sense of struggle of these women, whether it was Rameshwari Nehru, whether it was Amrita Preetham, or the other, or Vijaylakshmi Pandit, etc., etc. So this how I try to deal with the biographical issues of Rameshwari Nehru. And very important thing is Anand Bhavan, the importance of Anand Bhavan in her life. She was married as a teenager and she came to Anand Bhavan in 1902 and she was there almost till 1928. She came as a teenager and she matured as a woman. And there she discovered her life's purpose, a sense of struggle, experimented with media, and founded Istri Darpan. And there she also found her identity as a crusader for rights. So, as far as Anand Bhavan is concerned, there was old Anand Bhavan, and the picture you see is the new Anand Bhavan. Old Anand Bhavan was gifted to the nation in 9th April 1930, when Jawaharlal Nehru said, when I am the owner of this Bhavan, it will go to the nation. And Motilal Nehru quipped, why not now? And thus it was Swaraj Bhavan. And it was the locale, it was a center of many political activities, and it was here that Gandhiji had started his thinking about non-cooperation movement. It was here that bonfire of clothes was there, and so on and so forth. And it was a training ground for the Nehru women, whether it was Rameshwari Nehru, Uma Nehru, or Vijaylakshmi Pandit, or Kamla Nehru, and so on and so forth. And thus, we come to the next phase of Rameshwari Nehru's life, which when she went out of Anand Bhavan. But for a moment, we would stay with Rameshwari Nehru in Anand Bhavan itself, where she had founded Istri Darpan, as a picture was flashed of the first two issues, title pages of Istri Darpan, which has just gone away. I don't know where is it now. So yes, now One is of the title page of 1916 issue, the other is of the 1919 issue. And on the side, on the margins, you can see the its title page where the pictures of women as imagined in the religious texts, Lakshmi, Durga, and Saraswati, etc., etc. These were there. And this was the practice at that time, that most of the journals, they had flashed or they had painted the images of women in various forms. And many other, there were a number of journals or women's magazines which were being printed there in Allahabad, in Lahore, Aligarh, etc. But what is so important about Sri Dharpan is that it was founded by a woman and it was edited by a woman, and rest of the journals, these were started by men, and they frequently co-opted their wives as assistant and in other capacities also. Now, how is Istri Darpan important? I call it a social action journal. Its importance or its aims were, that is how to change the self-image and the worldview of women, those who were the readers as well as the contributors. And the second important thing was to change the socialization process of women and the girl child. When I say socialization, I mean how the children should be brought up, girls in a different way and boys in a different way. And by the time a girl or a boy was 10 years old or a teenager, then they knew where the line should be drawn. Women to stay at home, and with Yajnapaveet, boys should go out and deal with and act in the outer world. And that is important, the how, why the socialization process should be changed. Third important thing was how to train the readers, whether girls or whether men or the boys or women, that is to become critical, that is creating a generation of critical thinking boys and girls and men and women. When I say boys and girls, because Istri Darpan was divided into two sections. One was edited by Rameshwari Nehru, and the other was edited, which was called Kumari Darpan. It was edited by Roop Kumari Nehru, which was specially meant for the teenage boys and teenage girls. Now, to go on further on, important thing is that Istri Darpan had trained, or I would say, it had trained women to articulate their views, their perceptions of the world. That is, make them thinking human beings. That is important. So that is why I find Istri Darpan a very great enterprise which had trained Rameshwari Nehru herself to participate in the public life. And another important thing is his technique. His technique was juxtaposition of views, debates in which both the points of view were projected. Uma Nehru, who was the daughter-in-law of Nandalal Nehru, Pandit Motilal Nehru's elder brother, so she was a feminist. She would talk about Hamara Samaj, Hamare गलत रीति रिवाज and so on and so forth. But Rameshwari Nehru would give space to both points of view. And thus, what was the purpose of giving this? That is, the readers would get a balanced view about a problem, about society, about an ongoing struggle, whether it was the independence struggle or it was the women's movement itself. So, I would say the second phase of Rameshwari Nehru's life, it was in 1928 when Kanhaiya Lal Mishra took over. Her husband Brijlal Nehru had been transferred to Delhi, and her scene of action was also transferred to Delhi itself, where she started her public life, for which she had prepared herself as an editor of Istri Darpan. And then further on, now the issue is, uh, what is so important about her public life? Shweta ji has almost given overview of her life, where of various activities she was doing. I am not going into in detail or discuss those activities in detail. What I am going to do is uh, focus on her role in the Indian women's movement. That is important. And especially in the Indian women's movement, the fight for, I would say, for the rights, political rights of women. Istri Darpan had given them social dignity. She had fought for the social dignity of women. That is, they should not be treated as oppressed, they should not be treated as pound to duty, they should not be treated as dumb cattle, and further on in the public life, they should be active participants, whether in the freedom struggle or in the social struggles which were ongoing. And coming back to Indian women's movement, she had attributed women's activism to the fundamental injustice of inequality in the foundation of society. And she had expressed these views in the British Commonwealth League session in London 1932. And she repeatedly said, women, unlike men, were and continue to be burdened with social, customary, legal disabilities such as parda, child marriage, widowhood, pro-male inheritance, and lack of citizenship rights. So she summed up the whole problem in the faulty construction of society. And with the Gandhiji, whom she accepted as a leader, but she differed with him at many a time. But she had maintained, sometimes she argued against Gandhiji that women had never a fair deal. Gandhiji idealized Indian society. She refused to do that. And she also repeatedly said that subordinate position of women was really at the basis of all the oppression, social oppression, which, of which women is the recipient. Now, the second part of this, second aspect of the Indian women's movement is nature of Indian women's movement. She has she has she felt that since society was unjust, since there was a lack of equality, and women always suffered from social inequalities, and these stem from similar social and cultural. That is, she tried to differentiate between Indian and Western women's movement, and her view was that they were different countries.
Someone is unmuted. Kindly mute yourself, Vandana. Yeah, you are disturbing. Please mute yourself. Yeah.
I just muted her.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Kamlesh ji, sorry about that. Will you please finish now?
Should I restart?
Yeah, please. Yeah,
Okay. So
you can finish.
she had analyzed the difference between, I think there is a problem still.
Someone is Devyani Vora. Please stop sharing. Devyani ji. Please stop sharing your screen. Devyani Vora. Yeah, I think you can resume now. You can
Yeah,
resume,
okay.
Kamlesh. Yeah.
All right. Uh, what is so important is when we talk about the women's movement, there is a difference in the context of Western women's movement and the Indian women's movement. Why this difference is there? India's had a hierarchy. There was the hierarchical basis of Indian society, and though of course hierarchy was not absent in the Western society, but there was somewhat egalitarian practices also. Then a very important issue was India's status as a colony, and Western nation was independent and it was imperialistic. It always imposed its perceptions, its views on India and its perception of Indian traditions also. Then uh, why Indian women's movement not become militant like the Western women's movement? The reason was there was an absence of an educated urban middle class, and women were not educated who could become militant, who could ask for their rights. And Rameshwari Nehru identified Indian women's lower and subordinate status and oppression because uh, of Parda. And so she kept on repeating.
Professor Kamlesh, can I
Pardon?
disturb you for a while? Can you just wind up now because we have other speakers? Can you just wind up and conclude so that we have other speakers lined up? It is going fine, but maybe in 1 or 2 minutes, if you can wind up.
No, I just do. She has struggled for votes for women, their political rights. That is very important. And uh, Istri Darpan had already prepared the ground for that. I would, in fact, come to conclusion. What I would not go to the first phase or the second phase of the political rights, her struggle for the political rights. What I'll do is that it's come to the conclusion. What is her contribution to All India Women's Conference? I hope I have 5-7 minutes. Hello?
Maybe one minute
Can I
only.
take 5?
And no, that'll be a little only one or 2 minutes. Sorry about that.
Yes.
Yeah, please. Yeah,
I think
yeah,
you know, use.
Please continue.
Okay,
Hello.
For Mrs. I wish to sum up the contribution of Rameshwari Nehru. One important contribution was that she had brought the shift from exclusive concern with women's problems and reform to the broad concerns of social and national development and human relationships across narrow boundaries of caste, religion, race, and gender. As far as the nature of a contribution is concerned, that is to enable women to shoulder full responsibility for the promotion of their educational and social advancement. And then she also contributed a lot to the All India Women's Conference. And one main contribution to the Women's Conference is that she had enlarged its goals and activities. That is, she had included removal of untouchability on the agenda of AIWC, and she has also focused attention upon communal unity, which are very important. Thus, she had broadened the social base and bridged the gap between Hindus and Muslims. Then she had brought in the concept of inclusive social struggles. That is the have-nots, that is the Dalits, etc. She tried to link All India Women's Conference from their elite perspective to Harijans, to poor people, and thus she emphasized khadi and village industries, and she affirmed her faith in Gandhian ideals. vision. And finally, I would say that Rameshwari Nehru, quite being brought up as a council woman, she had become a radical woman without, and also she had negotiated patriarchy. She knew patriarchy. She had adjusted with men and thus evolved a vision without causing the society to change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kamlesh ji. That was amazing. Wide perspective you gave. I'm so sorry we had to interject, but there are the speakers. Maybe someday we'll have a full lecture in the library. I promise you, because I know the scholar that you are. You would have more to say. Now, moving on to the next item on the program. Now we have a very interesting circle of conversation between Mr. Ashok Nehru. He is an industrialist consultant and eldest grandson of Mrs. Rameshwari Nehru and Professor Neera Mishra, chairperson and founder of Draupadi Dream Trust with strong links to Prayagraj, the city where Mrs. Rameshwari Nehru began her journey of women's emancipation. I would really love to introduce you elaborately, but since we are running so short of time, I would quickly add a few things about the bios of both the resource persons. Mr. Ashok Nehru, as I just said, is an industrialist. He's an entrepreneur by profession and is the grandson of Mrs. Rameshwari Nehru. He, in the 60s, he was in the private sector, in the Swedish companies, and the regional manager in all across India in the 70s, and several companies throughout in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I really like the way you call yourself as the real, essentially a marriage broker between Indo-Swedish partnerships. That's the one thing that really marks your resume. And in the 1990s and 2000s, you when India got liberalized and the industrial scenario changed, the industrial development diversified. So he also changed his vocation, and he would, report these developments and the political developments during this time. He has surveyed IT parks in various states for his clients and introduced them to UK and to other foreign companies in Europe. And is also assisted several innovations in Australia, with Australia, Indian companies. And so basically he's tying up the Indians with the foreigners. That is a great job. We welcome you, Mr. Ashok Nehru. As we all know, most of us in the AIWC have heard of Professor Neera Mishra. She's the chairperson and founder of Draupadi Dream Trust, through which, since almost 2 decades, she has been working to create a better understanding and appreciation of ancient Bharatiya Itihas, civilization, culture, and knowledge systems. She does this through various projects and programs, and more than eight of her books are published, with many articles and talks on related themes. She is a consultant and member with several government and private projects on the Indian heritage, Bharatiya heritage as we call it, and also visiting professor to various government and private universities. I should not abstain from talking about your interest in Ayurveda. I know that personally, how you were associated with my father-in-law at one time. And she has her deep ancestral links to the ancient spiritually evolved kingdom of Kampilia. Very interesting. This word really draws us to you. Present day Farrukhabad, and that was the place of the Drupad kingdom, the kingdom of Drupad, the Panchal Pradesh, and that's why maybe you are named Draupadi.
Yes. Yes. It's
Thank
all
you so much. It's a pleasure having both of you with us. Please unmute and carry on with your conversation. We are all ears. Thank you so much. Come.
Namaskar to everybody, AIWC members, president and eminent members, and Ashok ji. I thank and congratulate AIWC for organizing this wonderful program of celebrating the past presidents, because it is actually a very educative program, highly knowledgeable, as it takes us through a journey of our nation's varied sensitive moments where women were significant contributors. I thank AIWC President Srimati Sheila Katkeji for making me a part of this program and extend a deep gratitude to Ms. Sweta, the Assistant Secretary AIWC, for her dedicated and persistent efforts in taking me and Ashok through a series of trials to ensure that the program goes off very smoothly. I'm greatly thankful to Dr. Mishra, Ruchika ji, and remembering my association with her father-in-law. And of course, he was so much instrumental in also helping me the excavations of Kampilya, the birthplace of Draupadi, through the Vice Chancellor of Lucknow University. This moment is really a great honor for me as we revive our memories with Prayagraj and Anand Bhavan. Very nostalgic because as a child, my father had brought us to visit this place, Anand Bhavan, then Anand Bhavan, and then took us to New Delhi, the Teen Murti house at where the then Prime Minister's residence of Jawaharlal Nehru, of course, post his death. As a child, it was just an exciting and sightseeing visit. But today, I realize its importance, and I realize what a memorable moment it is because as I grew up, I was actually educated about the deep roots of my family, not only with Kampilya for many centuries, but also with Anand Bhavan, because my ancestral family, specifically my father's Masa, a legal luminary from Prayagraj, Sri Parmanand Pathak, had, as per our records and records that are available with the parliament also, in the early 1920s, the Anand Bhavan was sold by him to Motilal Nehru for 18,000 rupees. And that was a much talked about thing. And and I'm very fascinated by the fact that Srimati Rameshwari ji, how she transformed herself into this progressive activist for women issues. Her one statement was very important for me that all housewives also need to be involved in social work because that's a medium for their contribution. हमारे यहाँ अर्ध नारेश्वरी का जो concept है, she really lived up to it. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity and I welcome Ashok Nehru ji into this conversation. And Ashok ji, I would actually like you to start off by telling us about the initial parts like her education, her marriage, her transformation from Lahore to India, to sort of Prayagraj, and the changes. And then as we go along, the different aspects in which she contributed in so many ways, 1942, the refugee movement, the other international affairs of women, etc. So welcome, Ashok, and please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Neeraji. And thank you, Sheila ji, for permitting me to be part of this program. Can I have myself as a slightly... Can you see me properly? Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, yes, you're very audible. Thank you. We can see and hear you nicely.
You can do that. Okay, very good for you. I'd also like to thank Srimati Shweta Talwar for the way she has brought me into this program and the enormous amount of work which she's done and the research which she's done on Rameshwari Nehru and on her life, and has put up the on the screen, put up the photographs. Now, there's one little misconception here about my grandmother's education. Contrary to the popular feeling also mentioned in the internet, that she came from a very Parda conscious family and that she'd had no formal education. In fact, it's very clear from my father's memoirs that my great-grandfather had her taught Farsi by a Maulvi, and Sanskrit by a Pandit. And she was therefore fluent in both these languages and their scripts. And she learned English through the help of her brother. Her brother had a tutor, and I think she got a lot of help from that. So she, by the time she went into that very emancipated and modern English-speaking house in Anand Bhavan, the fact that she was fluent in English helped matters very greatly for her. We also found that as she went into that place, at the beginning, as she confessed to her son, that she was so. She was the first time she met people who were not from the family in Anand Bhavan. She said it was embarrassing for her. She was so embarrassed that she said, I felt as if I was naked. This was the reaction at that time. But she blossomed in that place, and she saw that she could develop her own personality. She was an activist from the very beginning. You could see that. Neera, you had wanted to.
Yeah. So I just so this is really a good enlightenment about her education and her transformation. I would like you to take us through a small, bit in interesting anecdotes which show her involvement in the freedom struggle. Also, there are specific incidents related to 1942 and such like.
Well, she was by that time a well-known activist, and she was by 41, 42, she was closely associated with the AIWC, and she was determined to make an impact. And for that matter, once the Quit India movement began, she determined that she was going to go to jail. The result of that was, I got this through a combination of different sources. One was that my father, in his memoirs, said that the chief minister of the United Punjab, at that time, it was a very big province, spreading from Delhi all the way to the Khyber to the what is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. He knew my great-grandfather very well, Raja Narendranath, and they both tried to convince my grandmother not to attempt to break the law. And the chief minister said that you are shortening the life of your father by indulging in this kind of prison going, and it is not going to bring freedom more quickly. It might shorten his life, for that matter. And I just recommend to you, don't do it, because we will have to arrest you. She said, I accept with respect what you have said, but I am going to do it. You have to arrest me. So she announced that there would be a meeting of the AIWC in Lahore, whereupon the orders were issued by the police to have her arrested. And the sub-inspector came in there and touched her feet and then said, Mataji, aap hamare saath aiye. Now that is what I got from my father's book. Something like 5 years ago, I was called by my uncle, who was her nephew. And he said, Ashok, come here. I don't have very much longer to live because he had advanced cancer. I must tell you something that I heard, that I saw myself. I said, just tell me, what was this? He said, 4 or 5 days after she was arrested and put into that jail, along comes the chief minister to meet the Raja Sahib again. And he said, Diwan Sahib, मुझे बहुत बुरा लग रहा है कि तो रम्मो जी को हमें जेल में डालना पड़ा. So he says, but you were doing your duty. She broke the law and you arrested her. नहीं, वो तो मान लेता हूँ मैं. मगर she must be feeling great discomfort. But he said, what can you possibly do? He said, I'll tell you what to do. प्रमोद जी को जरा आराम देने के लिए ये सुंदरी उनकी नौकरानी हैं, तो she'd been a lifelong maid with her. You ask her to keep her sanduk ready and to go outside the gate of this Fairfield, this great establishment that he ran, and just shout once, "Quit India, quit India." And we will arrest her at once. Now, this is a 12-year-old man who was, he was 12 years old. He was telling me, he said, "I don't believe you." He said, "It's true." So Sundari went in there and looked after her. She was in jail for 9 months, but life was made very much easier for her. So that is one
That's
story.
very interesting. So could you continue in the same field on her contribution to later developments and her work for the refugees, the two sides that she saw? And I think there was very interesting incident where she says we had already given ourselves up for dead.
Yeah.
Yes.
That came to us through my father's book again. The basics are there. They were very worried about her. There was no telephone connection after 1940, after August 15. Telephones were not working. And something like a month after there were riots going on in the Muslims are being slaughtered in Delhi and Hindus are being slaughtered in the Punjab. And there's eviction taking place from the Punjab. But Lahore was full of women and children refugees, and that was her home, and she was in charge of the camps there, and she was looking after them there. They had no news apart from the fact that she was looking after the refugees. So the Prime Minister was going for a meeting with Liaquat to decide on some financial problems. He said, "I'm worried about Ramo." So he said, "Can I come along and see what the situation is?" So he said, "You hop into the plane with me." And they had 2 stops in between, and he was getting into a more and more violent temper because he could see the convoys on both sides of miserable people traveling east to west and west to east. They arrived in Lahore, and he said, "You give Rammo my love and tell her we want her to come back immediately." And then he had the give him a car with a Sten gunner at the back, and they started moving. There was nobody in the house in Fairfields. House was untouched, but there's nobody in the house. And she was the police jeep started heading for the refugee camp. And they suddenly saw my grandfather's Buick, this old car, heading for Fairfields. So they stopped en route, and they said, "Are you both okay?" They said, "Yes." How can you look so low, so happy and carefree? My grandmother said, "Well, we have practically given ourselves up for dead. Once you're dead, there's nothing you can do about it. So we are living life to the full. And come and have a meal with us." And they got a huge meal. And father said, "We are getting no fruits and vegetables in Delhi." So she sent the driver out to go to the bazaar and to get fruits and vegetables. He came back with a great tokri full of that. And in getting the more details about this, she said that Qurban Ali Khan, who was by that time the IG of police in Lahore, had been a wonderful support. He had, and the one time that she felt that a mob would attack the refugee camp, she rang up Qurban, and he sent such a large contingent of armed policemen there, who was so threatening to everybody around, that the Gundas simply disappeared and said, "We cannot touch these people." And she remained with them till the end of October 1947, when the people were permitted to leave also again with an armed escort provided by Qurban Ali Khan, and were taken to the border. One can't say that they had with their belongings. They had no belongings, but these people were taken to the border, and my grandparents managed to come and join us in Delhi, in the house in which we were living. They came as refugees. They'd lost everything there, just like everybody else. And in 47, when they came, she was immediately appointed the advisor, I think it was on an honorary basis, to the Ministry of Relief and Rehabilitation. And she was put in charge of the refugees to help them resettle themselves. And active as ever, she got involved in the development of housing for them in, I think it was Lajpat Nagar at that point, and of new housing in the town of Faridabad, which is some 20 miles away, which was being developed as a new town for them. But we children in Delhi had a very
Neeraji, please unmute yourself. Neeraji, unmute yourself, please.
Can you do it? I think she's asking. We cannot hear you, Neeraji.
Please unmute. Please unmute.
Can you do that, Supriya? Can you do that for her? Supriya, is it possible for you to do that?
Neeraji, please unmute yourself.
She's not able to do that. Supriya, you can try.
No, we can't do it. We are sending the request, but it's not happening.
Oh.
Can you? Is that interfering with your hearing of what I'm?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
Perfect.
so Ashok,
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Sorry,
Yes.
Ashok, I wanted you to share something about two interesting aspects. One, her progressive nature in accepting a Norwegian wife, and secondly, her interaction with the communists, and later her experience in America with the capitalists. So these two aspects are very interesting.
I'll go back to this. My mother was not Norwegian; she was Hungarian.
Hungarian, yeah.
Oh, well, Norway, Hungary. What difference does it make?
Yeah.
In any case, but it was interesting because my father had gone to the LSE to earn his degree in economics, and he'd gone there, and the story, as we heard it, was that she was dancing with her then boyfriend, Italian, called Egidio Ortona, who we got to know quite well later, and as they danced, he said to her in French, "Look at that, quel beau Indien, very handsome Indian." As they turned around, danced around, she set eyes on him and he set eyes on her. But in the tradition of those days, the situation was that he could not.
Ashok ji, can we shorten this part, because we want to come to the part of the president of America and her influence on communists, because
All right.
they have to wind up, So can you be a little brief, please?
We just say it took 5 years for them to wear down to get permission from both sides to get married. She arrived in India for a 1-year trial, and she arrived wearing a sari and speaking fluent Hindi. You can well imagine that impact that created.
Yeah, and
Okay.
then
She went
I
out.
think you could share your experience about her experience in America with her sons and President Johnson.
That you want us to go to the last one? Yes, sure. She had, because of the communist leanings of some CPI people who got her involved in the communist women's movement and labor movement. Yeah, I know that. And for which she was awarded the Lenin Peace Prize. When she arrived in the United States after her husband died in 1965, she went to join my parents, where father was ambassador then, and to live at their home. And she used to go out to the zoo, which was not far away, and she used to talk to everybody. And she found the Americans hugely family oriented. They looked after their children. They went out in groups as families. They were prepared to talk with her. They were very open, and she realized that she had been completely misled. This coincided a couple of months later with Indira Gandhi's visit to Washington, where Johnson had a party for her. Party for Mrs. Indira Gandhi, a formal reception. And when in that reception where everybody knew each other, my grandmother didn't know anybody, so she was sitting all alone. And Johnson suddenly said to my father, "Oh, look at that, your mother is sitting there all alone. Let's go and talk to her." And he said, "Mother, you are sitting here all alone. What is it that you? What is it that we can do for you?" I've got an actual wording of what he said. I've taken that from the book, and he said that he said the following. It's quite interesting. Oh dear, what's happened to it? Well, in essence, he was extremely charming. And he said,
two sons of yours are here with you.
Your two sons are here
with
you.
Yeah.
And she just fell for him completely.
Yes.
And then when she asked for permission, because she didn't want to listen to Pablo Casal's title.
So, Ashok, can we move on to something very interesting that you had shared about her interaction with you as a child when she told you stories from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata?
Well, the joy that we had when she came into our home was there was a grandmother there. Grandmother, putting aside all the horrors of the partition, she used to sit down with us three boys who were 10, 8, and 6, and every evening read to us one story from the Ramayana. And we found it absolutely fascinating. And every day we said, "Dadi, Dadi, ek aur kahani." And she said, "Nahin, one kahani each day. Now you boys go to bed, come back tomorrow, and I'll tell you the next story." So we got the Ramayana, we got the Krishna story, and we got a lot of the Mahabharata.
So that takes us through a journey of a very interesting personality who broke all traditions for the betterment, not only enhancing her personality, but contributing to other women's emancipation through an example of her own. Not only that, living the traditional life to make sure that her children, her grandchildren, everybody is taken care of. A true representative of a woman that we read about in ancient Indian Vedic literature, Nar Nari Ka, educated woman. So we are very grateful to Ashok for sharing these interesting anecdotes. And over to Dr. Mishra, because I think I have got the message that we need to wind up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Neera Mishra and Mr. Ashok I mean, we don't have words to thank you. It was so interesting, and one feels like it should go on and on. And I think each day is a story with Mrs. Rameshwari Nehru around as the grandmother. I mean, we can all imagine. But thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
Here.
Bringing it down.
More later. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Ashok
you.
Nehru. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Now
much.
we move on to another personality of the same family, Mrs. Vijaylakshmi Pandit. Of course, you all know her, and how such a great personality she was, equally, matched. She was the 16th president of AIWC, a diplomat, a politician, and one of the world's leading women of the 20th century. We all know that very well, how she was elected to the UN General Assembly as one of the world's first woman president. So she had so many firsts to her credit. And now for this, I would like to invite our member in charge, Roshni, Mrs. Chitra Sarkar. She would be presenting Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit, a role model for modern times. Over to you, Chitra.
Thank you. Thank you, Yutika.
And not to miss mentioning you as, she has worked in Air India and is a member of Ujjwal Women's Association for some time. Great going, Chitra. Over to
Thank you. Thank you. And namaskar, Madam President Sheila Kakre, Secretary General Kuljit Kaur, Rehana watching remotely, dear sisters of AIWC and distinguished speakers. My presentation today will be on Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit, our 16th president. Give me a minute to share my presentation. Okay.
Yes.
When we think of Vijaylakshmi Pandit, we usually think of her in the context of her older brother, and we think of her as his little sister. But I hope by the end of my presentation, we will all share my own great admiration for this lady. She was an extremely talented and capable person in her own right. And she would be a worthy role model for all of us at AIWC even today. Vijaylakshmi Pandit was born on the 18th of August, 1900 in Allahabad. Her parents, Motilal Nehru and Swarup Rani, were Kashmiris who had settled in the plains. She was their second child and eldest daughter, and they named her Sarup Kumari. It was only after she got married that her husband's family named her Vijaylakshmi Pandit. And at the time of her birth and right through her childhood, she was known as Sarup Kumari. Of course, we all know she had an older brother named Jawaharlal, who was 11 years older than her, and a younger sister named Krishna, who was 7 years younger. Sarup's nickname was Nanhi, and so that got shortened very soon to Nan. And her little sister was called Choti Beti, and that became Betty. At the time of Sarup Kumari's birth, Motilal Nehru was a very successful lawyer, and the family lived in a lavish, westernized manner with many servants in a large joint family. Their family mansion, as we have already heard, was called Anand Bhavan. Are you getting an echo, everybody, or can you hear well?
No, it's perfect.
It's fine.
Okay.
It's quite.
Thank you. Thank you. So their family mansion, as we have already heard from previous speakers, was called Anand Bhavan. Later, Motilal became a leading figure in the national movement, and Anand Bhavan became the center of Swadeshi activities. As we have heard, he was the patriarch of a large joint family. In addition to his own children, he looked after all his brother's children. And that is how Rameshwari Nehru and her husband, who was Motilal's nephew, spent many years in Anand Bhavan. So did some of the other stalwarts of the Nehru extended family. They all came under the spell of nationalism because of their patriarch. In 1930, Motilal Nehru donated Anand Bhavan to the country after it had been named Swaraj Bhavan in honor of the freedom movement. He then built a smaller home for his family in the same compound and named it again Anand Bhavan. Here is Swaraj Bhavan. If you go to Allahabad, you can visit this national monument and relive the great days of the independence movement, because many of the famous events of the independence movement took place in this building, this house, this family home. Here is a picture of the Nehru family taken in around 1908. And you can already see the bond between this brother and sister. They both got their arms around each other. This is, of course, the dashing Jawaharlal Nehru and his sister Sarup Kumari, later known as Vijaylakshmi. The family patriarch Motilal, their mother, that is the children's mother and his wife, Swarup Rani, and their little baby sister, Krishna. Sarup Kumari was educated at home by English governesses. She never attended a formal school or college. This makes it doubly remarkable that she could hold her own on the world stage along with seasoned politicians and diplomats. In 1921, when Sarup turned 21, she married a young Maharashtrian barrister named Ranjit Pandit. In accordance with the custom, her name was changed to Vijaylakshmi Pandit, and that is how the country knew her ever afterwards. Ranjit Pandit was a highly educated young man. He had studied at Oxford, Sorbonne, and Heidelberg. He was a barrister from the Middle Temple. He spoke 11 languages. He was a classical scholar. He played the violin. He had a beautiful, trained singing voice. He also played polo and tennis. And as you can see from the photograph, he was quite a looker too. Until 1926, that is about 5 years after his marriage, he practiced law in Calcutta, or Kolkata as it is known now, after which he resigned and he joined his brother-in-law Jawaharlal in the nationalist movement. And here is Vijaylakshmi as a young woman, shortly after she got married. Here we have a photograph of the Nehrus after Ranjit Pandit joined their family. So here is Ranjit, and here is the patriarch Motilal, his son Jawaharlal, his sisters. This is Jawaharlal's wife, Kamla Nehru, and of course, the very young Indira Gandhi, and then of course, Indira Nehru. This is a slightly later picture. Here you have the two brothers-in-law dashing off to address a freedom rally, and you can see how purposeful they look on their way to rousing the nation's sentiments. This is a slightly later picture with Ranjit and Vijaylakshmi, and a slightly older but still very young Indira and Padmaja Naidu. Ranjit and Vijaylakshmi had 3 daughters, Chandralekha, Nayantara, and Rita. We are privileged today that in a later segment of the program, we will hear Nayantara's daughter Gita Segal talking to us about the memories of her grandmother. This is Chandralekha, the eldest daughter of the Pandits as a young woman. And here are the 4 of them together, the 3 sisters and their mother. This is Rita, Chandralekha, Vijaylakshmi, and Nayantara. Leaves from a family album. In 1937, Srimati Pandit was elected to the provincial legislature of the United Provinces. She was designated Minister of Local Self-Government and Public Health, and she held this post until 1938, when the provisional government resigned to protest British policies. In December 1941, Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit was elected the 16th president of the All India Women's Conference, that is our very own revered and respected organization. Here is a photograph taken in December 1941 of the standing committee just after Vijaylakshmi was elected president. This is her in the middle and all her standing committee members. Let me read out an excerpt from Srimati Pandit's presidential address at AIWC, where she highlights the importance and the role of women in the national movement. So I quote, "As women, we have a special responsibility cast upon us. We must decide whether we shall ally ourselves to the forces of life or those of death. Are we going to join the group that by their acquiescence makes wars possible? Shall we bear sons only that they may murder other women's sons and help to maintain a system which stands self-condemned? Or shall we raise our united voice in favor of a brave new world where human life and human liberty receive the respect which is their due, where the progress and security are within the grasp of each individual? The choice is before us. The future, not for women only, but for humanity as well, is what the women of today make of it. Let us not treat this matter lightly." I think her words are relevant to us even today. Mrs. Pandit was the president of AIWC during 1942 and 1943, and these were extremely momentous years, both for herself personally, as well as for the country, India. The first event of 1942 was a very happy family event. Her niece Indira got married to Firoz Gandhi, a family friend that she had known for many years. And Indira's pink wedding sari had been spun and woven out of yarn that had been spun by her father while he was in jail. And of course, you can't see the color, but it was known that Pandit Nehru could spin very fine yarn and made a very beautiful sari, which is in the museum at Teen Murti Marg. The next month, in March 1942, things changed dramatically, because the British government sent a delegation to India under Sir Stafford Cripps, who was the leader of parliament at that time. And this meeting or this mission came to be known in history as the Crips Mission. And its purpose was to negotiate with Congress to obtain cooperation with the British during the war and in the British war effort. However, the talks failed because the British made no attempt to understand or accede to any of the wishes and aspirations of the Indians. Here is Sir Stafford Cripps being greeted by Ranjit Pandit and Jawaharlal Nehru. After the Crips mission returned to the UK as a failed mission, Gandhiji gave a very famous and historic speech in Mumbai, then called Bombay, at Gowalia Tank, which is now called August Kranti Maidan, on the 8th of August 1942, calling for an end to British rule in India. This was the famous Quit India movement. Congress prepared to escalate civil disobedience, and very soon its leaders were all in jail. And so our 16th president joined hundreds of other freedom fighters, got arrested, and was thrown into Naini Central Jail. She was jailed in August 1942, and this was her third jail term. Her eldest daughter Chandralekha and her niece Indira joined her in Naini Central Jail in the very next month. Meanwhile, her husband Ranjit and her brother Jawaharlal were incarcerated in Bareilly jail. Far from breaking her spirit, her jail term gave her time to introspect and analyze the experience of prison. And she wrote a book about her experience called Prison Days. This book is still in print, and you can still order it on Amazon, no less. She was released in July 1943. She was arrested in August 1942. She was released in July 1943. And immediately upon her release, she decided that she had to go to Bengal, which was at that time in the grip of a horrific man-made famine. It is estimated that about 3 million people died in that famine. And here is her report in her own words. I quote, "I had been president of the All India Women's Conference since the previous year, and on arrival, got in touch with the Bengal branch. The members were glad to join in whatever kind of work could be done. Renuka Rai, one of the stalwarts of the Congress and a person of much social and political experience, was a tower of strength. Urmila Mehta, Secretary General of the Women's Conference and a woman of great courage and capacity, came all the way from Gujarat to help. There were many others of whom I think fondly and gratefully." On her return from Bengal, Vijaylakshmi found her husband had suffered a heart attack in jail, followed by several complications. He had contracted pleurisy, which was fatal in the days before penicillin. And on the 14th of January, 1944, Ranjit Pandit passed away. He was just 50 years old. The horrific prison conditions he had endured had destroyed his health. Her husband's death was understandably a severe shock to Vijaylakshmi, but very soon this was followed by another shock. She discovered that in accordance with the existing laws of the land, she did not inherit anything from her husband's estate after his death, and everything was taken by Ranjit Pandit's brother. On observing the plight of our own president, the All India Women's Conference started its campaign on the inheritance rights of women, and we continued this struggle until the laws were changed after independence. This is one of our finest platforms and one in which we did eventually succeed. In 1946, Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit was elected to the Constituent Assembly from the United Province, and hence she joined this very small, select and distinguished group of women who were a part of our Constituent Assembly and created our wonderful constitution, of which all of us are so very proud. I think all of us have seen this photograph hanging in government offices. It is a picture of Gandhiji and Pandit Nehru during the AICC session of 1946. I've included it here in the presentation because I think it's interesting to know what this picture looked like in its original and uncropped form. Guess who's right here, right in the middle of the action, right at the heart of the matter? Vijaylakshmi. This is actually the original picture. In 1947, of course, we know that India became independent. And after independence, Srimati Pandit joined the diplomatic service. She was India's ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1947 to 1949, United States and Mexico from 49 to 51, the United Kingdom as High Commissioner from 55 to 61, and concurrently to Spain from 1958 to 1961. So in her diplomatic days, here she is with Queen Elizabeth II, and here with Generalissimo Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain. And in addition to this, she headed the Indian delegation to the United Nations from the inception of the United Nations in 1946 right until 1968. Okay. In September 1952, sorry, give me a sec. Okay. Oops. Who is Kamal Sharma? Ritu, who's Kamal Sharma? Sorry about that. In September 1952, Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit scored another great first. She was elected President of the UN General Assembly. She was the first woman to hold this post. And here is a clip of her election. Have a look.
Is there no sound, Chitra? Sound?
Can you not hear the sound? I can hear it. Can anyone else not hear it?
No.
Yeah, we can't hear the sound.
Oh dear. Okay.
Yeah, increase maybe.
Let me just try and figure out what's going on and what's happened to the sound. There is definitely sound. No, one sec.
No, we cannot hear anything.
Okay, well, we'll have to leave this out. Let me see if we can go on to the next one. For some reason, this is jammed. I'm sorry. Okay, let's try. There was no sound on that. Can you see? Give me a sec. Let's just go back and okay. Nobody can hear the sound except us. तब तो हम सुन पा रहे हैं अभी कोई नहीं सुन पा रहा है Can anyone hear?
No.
No.
No. Okay.
No.
I think we'll stop wasting time on this. This was a nice clip, but
It'll take 2 minutes. No, let Ritu try it.
Yeah, Ritu is here, but she's not able
Let
to.
her do it. Huh?
Just stop. Okay. Hearing again. Mm-hmm. अभी सुनाई देगा? Yes. क्या हुआ? Can you hear now?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay. Now you wait here.
The United Nations General Assembly opens its 8th session with Malik and Vyshinsky of Russia attending. Secretary of State Dulles and Henry Cabot Lodge favor Madam Pandit of India for election as Assembly President. The delegates vote, and Madam Pandit wins, with 37 votes against 22 for Thailand's Prince Wanwaith Ayakan. Madam Pandit receives congratulations on becoming first woman president of the United Nations Assembly. Her election, she says, is in recognition of the part women will play in furthering the UN. Wearing the colorful sari of India, Madam Pandit assumes office. With the session a day old, United States Secretary of State Dulles.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Switch it on. One sec. Let me just announce. And here we have a clip. Sorry about all this confusion. Here we have a clip of her presidential address, the first address after her election. To watch.
I should like to express my deep appreciation to my fellow representatives for the great honor they have just conferred upon me. They responsibilities of this high office. I regard your choice as a tribute to my country and a recognition of her profound desire to serve the purposes of the United Nations and through them the paramount interests of world peace. It is also a recognition of the part that women have played and are playing in furthering the aims and purposes of this great organization. The tasks of every assembly are delicate and difficult, also present great opportunities. At this session, the opportunities are all the greater because the assembly meets in an atmosphere which offers hope of beginning to really resolve some of the tensions and conflicts that afflict us. For the first time since June 1950, fighting has ceased in Korea, and the way has been opened for a settlement in the Far East, which would immeasurably strengthen world peace and stability. All nations, we are sure, will watch the work of the political conference on Korea with hope and expectancy and will wish it success in its proceedings. We all hope and trust that the armistice achieved in Korea will prove a beginning from which the United Nations can move forward to still greater achievements. The many specific disputes threatening peace in various regions and the basic causes of unrest and insecurity demand our earnest and constant attention. Our provisional agenda provides us with every opportunity. We have the duty not merely to restore peace when it is broken, but even more to prevent peace from being threatened. We must find solutions to racial frictions and battle against organized and legalized discrimination. We must find solutions to the problems of poverty and want and recognize in action that prosperity and contentment cannot be achieved in compartments. We must seek to eliminate weapons of mass destruction rather than invent weapons which are even more destructive. Finally, we must discover a means of directing the resources of industry and the researches of science into peaceful instead of destructive channels. We must learn to cooperate effectively in safeguarding peace and in raising standards of living of peoples of the world. I pledge my own best endeavors to help bring our work to fruitful conclusions and to discharge the responsibility which you have laid upon me by electing me to this high office.
I apologize for this little glitch. These are analog movie clips that are 70 years old. So they didn't transmit as well as we had hoped, but eventually all is well that ends well. I hope you could hear everything, right? You could hear?
Yes, we did.
Thanks. Okay, so Mrs. Pandit's tenure as President of the United Nations General Assembly was a great success. And here you have leaves from the photo album again, giving a speech from the podium. This is her with the Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, and this is under the great insignia of the United Nations in the General Assembly Hall, receiving the President's gavel. She was well known for her elegance, although she never wore any jewelry except maybe a brooch, and she never dyed her white hair, and she always wore a sari, but she held her own with great dignity among all the leaders of the world. Here is Richard Nixon, this is Emperor Akihito of Japan, King Paul of Greece, and many, many more. After she completed her term as High Commissioner to the UK, Mrs. Pandit came back to India and was appointed Governor of Maharashtra from 1962 to 1964. So here she is in the heart of Bollywood with Nutan and Tanuja, very young Tanuja, if you can recognize her. This is a picture of the three of them in their later life. This is Mrs. Pandit with her older brother and her younger sister, Krishna Hadi Singh. In May 1964, her brother, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, passed away. She resigned as Governor of Maharashtra and sought and won election to the Lok Sabha from her brother's former constituency, Phulpur. In 1968, she resigned her parliamentary berth and stepped back from active politics. This was because she had some disagreement with her niece's policies, but they tried to conduct it with the greatest of dignity, as most of us of our age group will remember. She came out of retirement in 1977 to oppose the policies of Srimati Indira Gandhi in the general election, which brought the Janata Party to power. In 1979, she was appointed the Indian representative to the UN Human Rights Commission. Thereafter, she retired from public life and settled in Dehradun in the Himalayan foothills, where she passed away peacefully in December 1990 at the age of 90. And this brings us to the end of the life story of this incredible and talented lady. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chitra. That was an amazing presentation with a lovely clip and all rare photographs, as we can see. It was so enjoyable. Thank you so much for giving an insight in the life and the career, rather, of Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit, our 16th president. Now we go over to next item of today's program. This is a presentation by Mrs. Gita Segal, the granddaughter of Vijaylakshmi Pandit. She would talk about her grandmother. So I would request Chitra to introduce Mrs. Gita Segal.
Right, thank you. The only thing is that my video is not opening again, so I have to call Ritu. Ritu, please make this work. And in the meantime, it's not coming full screen. Just come back. In the meantime, I'll just tell you about Gita Segal. Gita Segal is the granddaughter of Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit. Thank you. And the daughter of the famous award-winning author, Nayantara Segal, who was the second daughter of Ranjit and Vijaylakshmi Pandit. Gita Segal is a well-known writer and journalist on issues of feminism and secularism. She's a documentary filmmaker and a women's rights and human rights activist. Gita was head of Amnesty International's gender unit and has opposed the oppression of women by religious fundamentalists. Today, she will share with us the memories of her grandmother, our 16th president. Gita, are you here? No, I think she couldn't join us.
She seems to be there.
I am here. I'm listening.
Oh, super, Gita.
Yeah,
welcome, welcome. And at the end of the segment, after we have your and then Dr. Karan Singh's clips, we will, I hope you'll be agreeable to take some questions. So let me now share the recording with Gita. We took a pre-recording because we did not want to risk disturbance in the network like we had a little earlier, especially since she was joining us from Dehradun. So here we are, one sec. Good afternoon, Gita, and thank you so much for joining us today. It is really an honor to have you with us. and tell us a little bit about yourself as an introduction. We all have heard about you and the work you're doing for women's rights, but just tell us for the sake of the webinar.
Well, thank you very much for having me on this webinar. I'm very grateful to the AIWC for the work you're doing to discover the history of the remarkable women who have been your presidents. Of course, my grandmother, Vijaylakshmi Pandit, was one, but there's one after the other. They're all extraordinary women who stood for women's rights in what is one of the oldest women's organizations in the world, which has had an unbroken existence. So I think this work is extraordinarily important, and I'm sure that the spirit of my grandmother is looking down on all of us and approving of it. About myself, well, I've spent a lot of my life in Britain, but my early working years after university were in India at a very crucial time, when that wave of feminism in the late 70s and early 80s was starting. This was the time when the first national demonstrations against rape in India were happening in protest against the rape of very poor Adivasi and Dalit women. There were anti-dowry movements, which I was part of. I was part of a play called Om Swaha, which we took to the neighborhoods where women had been killed. And so the women's movement was very lively and protesting. And when I went to England, I carried that with me. But I also carried the dissident spirit of my grandmother and the sort of anti-colonial inheritance that we had. So
thank you, Gita. So obviously your grandmother had a very major influence on shaping your values in your life. Can you tell us your early memories of her? How do you recall her when you think of her?
Well, of course, as most people's grandmothers are, are loved. The Nani is universally loved. You might argue with your parents, but your Nani is always there. And she certainly was. But the difference was with her was that she was herself so utterly iconoclastic that there was never any sense of pressure coming from her of having to be conform. I mean, she obviously wanted us to do well. She was very engaged with all of her grandchildren. She was concerned about all of us as individuals, not what we would do in terms of status and so on, but what was best for each of us. And what I suppose I remember really strongly was her absolute swiftness. I mean, she walked, she was like a whirlwind walking through anywhere. I remember going to Republic Day with her, and she was racing along, the street. And of course, people would recognize her. People would come in from the villages, peasants. In the days, people think celebrity culture has only just started. But these faces and figures were known, even before there was, mass internet or any of those kinds of things. Even television, we had one channel and most people didn't have televisions, but they knew who she was. And I would be very embarrassed actually by it, because I didn't want to be in the presence of somebody like that. But it was that swift walk where, us, much younger and presumably fitter were struggling to keep up, and her absolute uprightness and, sitting straight, and her outspokenness, where she wouldn't, brook any nonsense from anybody. So she could be quite cutting, if people were, somebody would come to her and say, oh, Mataji or Madam or whatever they were calling her at that point, you must find my mother, my daughter, a husband, I'm sitting at your feet, you must do this and do, and she would just roll her eyes and say, is your daughter a cow? so she could sometimes be quite rude, but she was also, yes, but she was also engaged. She was endlessly interested in people. So people would wander in and out. We can't live like that anymore. We live with a land mafia surrounding us. It's not safe now. But there everybody knew whose house it was and who she was. And she was very active in the Tibetan community. So I remember monks coming in and visiting her. I remember is when she was governor of Bombay. She was in the Raj Bhavan and we used to visit over there.
Really?
We heard about my Nanaji. We called Nehru Nanaji because he was our uncle, great uncle, but he was like our Nanaji. My mother always said she had 3 parents and our Nanaji had died during the Quit India movement, of his imprisonment. So I grew up with all those stories of how she died, how she'd been stripped of her inheritance. And in fact, I was very bitter. She was never a bitter person, but I was very bitter on her behalf until years later I realized that when Gandhiji told her, well, don't fight with the family anymore. You know, what's really important about your project to recover this history and the work that other historians are doing, and I hope that you will join up because it's important, is that so much is being dug up that's been in the archives and so on. So some of it I remember from family stories. I mean, I knew she'd worked in the Bengal famine, but I don't think I recall her telling me that she'd actually set up the first Save the Children, and she raised money abroad for it, you know. You know, the period of my grandfather's death was absolutely devastating to her, and she has written about it. I mean, he did not want to ask for any favors, and he had forbidden her to ask for any favors. So he was dying in prison without any help and, you know, proper medical support or anything like that. And she actually did plead for him to be released. And in a way, the British would have wanted him released because they didn't want the scandal of him dying in prison. But my mother recounts a story that as he, you know, in his last days, when people were sitting by his bed, he was, I mean, if he hadn't become a Gandhian, he would have been a great shikari. He was a great linguist and a Sanskrit scholar. He was a singer. He was a man who loved life. She also loved life in her own way. But he was sort of joking even with his dying breath and saying, you know, my wife is a very strange woman. Politics is her entire life. She has no time for anything else. and you know, she was.
Yes, they both gave their life to India.
And although her main achievements that are recognized are her diplomatic achievements, I think a lot of her heart was in the UP and the work she did on the ground as a health minister, steering the Gaon Hukumat bill, you know, land reforms. I mean, these were some of the great reformist movements, reforms that Congress implemented after independence. So, you know, that really stayed with me about how you work with people or oppose people who are your enemy and how you, at the same time, see their humanity. But, you know, she never deviated from her stand. I mean, you know, I just remember that sense of absolute lack of bitterness, you know, and her sense of being able to communicate with anybody. I mean, she told a story. She could, you know, talk in Purbiya. She could talk in any accent. You know, she could talk languages of people in different voices. And that's, of course, what she used later throughout her campaigning in the way she talked and whom she talked to. So towards the end of her life, when she settled in Dehradun, she never had a car. When my mother and stepfather came to live with her, they brought a car, and my stepfather drove. They had no chauffeur at that time, but she never had a car of her own. She used to get on the bus, which stopped outside the house, and go into the bazaar. And
at her age, she was past
in her 70s.
Yes, almost 70. Yes.
No, later than into her 70s, well into her 70s.
And into her 70s, yes.
She would go down, and I remember going into the bazaar with her. She loved going to, you know, the small places, the small little dhabas that served, you know, puri tarkari. You know, the more genuine, the better.
And never lost the common touch.
Absolutely, she just loved it. I mean, it didn't stop her. It might not have been the best thing for her health, but she enjoyed it, and she enjoyed talking to people on the way and all those sorts of things. She removed herself with great dignity from politics when she felt that she wasn't wanted. She didn't start a fight or another political party or anything. She just came and retired in Dehradun, which I think was a sorrow to her because she wanted to go on being useful and working. And when she came out in the emergency, it was very much to stand for the principles on which India was founded, for democracy and for civil liberties.
Thank you, Gita. It was a real privilege to be able to share your memories of your illustrious grandmother. And we have one more clip, after which I hope you will join us for some questions. Our next speaker is the very, very multifaceted and multi-talented personality of India, Dr. Karan Singh. He began his public service to the nation while he was still in his teens, under the mentorship of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. The Nehru family was always very proud of their Kashmiri heritage, and as such, they had a very close bond with Maharaja Hari Singh and with his only son, Dr. Karan Singh. Dr. Karan Singh received his master's degree and his doctorate from the University of Delhi. He served as head of state of Jammu and Kashmir. He has been a Rajya Sabha member of Parliament for Delhi, India's ambassador, and Chancellor of Banaras Hindu University. He's also a Sanskrit and classical scholar. And we feel privileged to hear his insights on Kashmirian, its impact on public service, and the ideals embodied by the Nehrus and himself. So I will just share my screen again for a presentation with, oh no, this is again gone wrong. Just wait. Okay.
Well, President and members of the All India Women's Conference, with whom I've been interacting for several decades, it's a pleasure to be back. And let me say, Kashmir has a very special ambience. It's beautiful. It's not only picturesque, but it has a certain inner beauty, let me say. Because in the valley I'm talking of, I'm not talking of Jammu and Kashmir as a full state. In the valley of Kashmir, we have the tradition, the ancient tradition of the Buddhists. Kanishka held his second international Buddhist conference in the valley in Harvard. Then we had the Shaiva revival, very strong Shaiva revival. We had Kashmir Shaivism, great acharyas like Acharya Abhinav Gupta, who were as great as Adi Shankaracharya. He was only in Kashmir, that's why he's not so well known, but he's as great in his own way. And then came the Sufis. Kashmir was conquered not by sword, but by the Sufis. Shah Hamdan came from Iran with 700 followers to begin with. And then gradually the Islamic background took over for many years. From the 14th century, it was a Muslim rule. And some of them were enlightened and some of them were not. But I suppose that's true of all rulers everywhere. So, but it does have a special, there's beautiful old temples, there's mosques there, the dargahs there where we used to go, Chirare-Sharif and Baba Rishi, Hazrat Wala, so on. There is a very inclusive culture. Unfortunately, over the last 30 years, the whole thing has been destroyed. And the brilliant, highly talented, highly educated Kashmiri Pandit community has had to move out, lock, stock and barrel. That would have broken Panditji's heart. Because, as you say, he was proud to be a Kashmiri. And he had a very special love for Kashmir, there's no doubt about it. He loved being there. Whenever possible, he came. I came into public life at the age of 18, and he was my mentor. He was the one, as you know, adopted me, and I was his protege. And that helped me through the very difficult time that I had to face. But Sheikh Abdullah was also there at that time, who was very anti-Dogra. It's a long history. So that's how Panditji came close. And not only Panditji, Panditji's family. The family at that time, Indiraji was the hostess, and two little boys were there, Sanjay and Rajiv. And of course, he met his very distinguished sister, Vijaylakshmi, whom we all called Auntie Nan. That was her pet name. So Auntie Nan also was that same generation also became very fond of me. And I met her on many occasions. I remember when my wife and I went to London first in the 60s, she was High Commissioner. And she had a beautiful party for us and invited a lot of interesting people and gave us theatre tickets and so on. So she was very gracious in one. She was a hard woman, mind you. She was not a namby-pamby woman. She was a tough lady.
Really? Tell us about that.
Yes. She was tough. Everybody knew that she was a tough lady. You know, tough lady in the good sense of the term. It's that, you know, she was very
exacting.
I suppose so as a boss. I never worked for her, but people say that she was very demanding and so on. That's okay.
Very high standards of working and so on.
Maybe that's it, punctuality, standards of working, cleanliness and so on. And that is why, as you know, she became the first chairman of the United Nations
General Assembly.
Then she went to America as ambassador. I went much later, of course. But when she was governor of Maharashtra in 1964, our first son was born. And she was so happy. She joined with us and me and Asha in celebrating the birth of...
Was he born in Bombay?
He was born in Bombay, Beach Candy Hospital.
Oh, really? And she was then governor of Maharashtra?
She was then governor of Maharashtra.
Yes.
So, and whenever we met, you know, she was very affectionate. And I knew Tara and Rita and Lekha. I knew all three of them, and I knew their husbands also. The two of them were in the foreign service. And so I knew the girl. They were really more or less my age.
Right. I think Tara is your contemporary.
Tara probably is my contemporary. I don't know exactly. But she would be Rita would be perhaps a little younger and Lekha would be a little years older.
Yes.
So I knew that family very well. And she was president of the All India Women's Conference. So to come back to Auntie Nan, she was always very affectionate and very hospitable, very immaculately dressed, with her grey hair brushed back. And, you know, she was a delight for the eyes, shall we say. And I remember her fondly. I've written her up. I've done a book called Meetings with Remarkable Women.
Really?
And she's one of them.
She is there in that book. We must get it for our library. We have a library in AIWC.
All these years you must have built up a good library.
Quite a good collection. She also preceded you as ambassador and as MP, and you knew them so well. Did you derive any inspiration from her?
Well, not really. All the inspiration I derived was from Jawaharlal Nehru. As I said, he was my mentor. He guided me. He was my role model. When growing up in school, and after that, when I read The Discovery of India and Autobiographies, that was what impelled me towards public life. And then we had pleasure to meet with her. Very distinguished lady, distinguished looking, very well spoken. Spoke very nicely.
And have you been in touch with her children since she passed?
No, I haven't actually. Tara occasionally. We did a release of something in Nehru Memorial Museum some years ago with Tara and Rita. They both came. That's the last time I saw them. Rita subsequently has passed away. Tara is living in Dehradun. I visited their house in Dehradun. That is where Auntie Nan probably passed away.
Yes.
It's a nice house on Rajput Road. So yes, you have a very nice president, and I'm sure you remember her fondly, and so do I.
Thank you so much, sir. It was so interesting hearing your insights about this very great lady. Namaskar. Thank you. That brings us to the end of the formal portion of the second half of this webinar. And in case there are any questions for Gita or any of the other speakers before the vote of thanks, I don't know what your plan is, Yuthika.
No, nothing. You're right. Actually, let's end the program. It's already way past our time. But if someone wants to give a comment, or maybe anyone, that's perfectly okay. Anyone who wants to join in, some of our members. Thank you so much, Chitra, for arranging this bit on Srimati Vijaylakshmi Pandit. It was really amazing. It's interesting to see how you went. I mean, online you did this. So that is a very good idea. I really liked it.
But technology... it still had its technical glitches, for which my apologies.
No. This is so fine. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to catch up with that.
That's true. That's true.
So
I remember that President and I were talking about the talent that runs through the Nehru family on public speaking and writing. President, did you have a question on their family talent? You're mute, Sheila.
Yes, wonderful talent they have. The whole family, starting from Jawaharlal Nehru, even Motilal Nehru also, Indira ji, Vijaylakshmi ji, all of them. And they are really good, very good speakers. And now Gita ji also. I haven't heard about Nayanthara ji, Gita ji's mother, but definitely Vijaylakshmi. I remember when I was child in Mumbai, I've heard her that time. And if you remember, Chitra, I spoke to you regarding the video also.
That's right. But there is something that you must tell Gita, Sheila ji. Gita, did you know that our president, Sheila ji, has actually lived in Anand Bhavan?
Oh, yes. Allahabad. Yes. When I was a kid, my father was an artist and he was given the job of doing the painting of Anand Bhavan in Prayagraj. And I stayed there when I was 1 year old. I've got the pictures, my mummy and daddy telling me about that incident, So when Chitra showed me that picture, I remembered at the background where I'm standing and background this Anand Bhavan is there. So that memory I shared with her.
I don't know whether Gita has actually stayed there.
No, I haven't stayed there. I was taken there by my grandmother in the 60s. I think Mrs. Gandhi donated Anand Bhavan also. That's the second Anand Bhavan to the nation. I remember being present when she announced it. And I think shortly after that, my grandmother took me to Allahabad, because we very seldom went to Allahabad. But we did a visit with her, and we went to Anand Bhavan, and we also went to the hospital. There was a very famous doctor, Dr. Vatsala. Sorry, I may be getting her name wrong. I remember her face so well. She started a hospital, and she was a very good doctor, and particularly a doctor for women, and a family friend. And so we visited her, and we visited the hospital as well. And those were my major memories. But no, unfortunately, we never stayed in Anand Bhavan because it was not occupied by the family after independence.
Yes, that's right. It was already given to the nation, so all of us can visit it. And the other thing that I thought interesting was the fond memories that Dr. Karan Singh had of your grandmother. He says she was a pleasure to look at, and how beautiful she looked, and also his memories of your mother. So I suppose you will be in touch with them soon.
I suppose so. We're all living very isolated lives at the moment to keep ourselves alive. But this whole session has been very fascinating for me, and I'm very glad that you got Professor Kamlesh Mohan to talk about Rameshwari Nehru and her work, and you also had the previous presentation about it, because she also is a relative. I mean, of course, I know my cousin Ashok, but many of us have not known as much about our family's professional and public lives as we should have. Even I knew the major highlights of my grandmother's life, but her biography is currently being written by a historian who lives in America. He's at an American college in New York, and he wrote a previous book called The Peacemakers about India's role at the UN. And he's now writing a biography of my grandmother, Vijaylakshmi Pandit. But I'm so glad to see that you got a biographer of Rameshwari Nehru, Kamlesh Mohan, to speak as well, because the significance of the life is not just in the highlights of the details of the positions they achieved, but what they did in the work that they were doing, and the analysis they brought to them. And I think all those things are really important. And I think this program of yours, this project of remembering the AIWC's leaders, and through that, the history of the organization, is, I think, extremely important. So I look forward to your future work.
Thank you, Gita. That's very encouraging.
So, with that note, shall we end the program? It's past 5. With your permission, Sheilaji. So now this has been really a great program. Thank you, Gita, for your final input. Yeah, anyone?
Yutika?
Yes.
May I
Yes.
say
Manjula ji.
Manjula.
Calcutta.
Yes.
I want to mention that when Vijaylakshmi Pandit came to Calcutta in those dreadful days in Calcutta in 42 to 45, they saved the children, the community.
Your voice is not clear, Manjula ji. Your voice is breaking. We cannot hear you. Manjula ji, are you there?
Thank you.
Can you repeat what you were saying? आपकी आवाज नहीं है clear. You were saying something about in Calcutta. Can we hear you? Yeah.
That Vijaylakshmi Pandit came to Calcutta in the 19th.
No, it's not clear. Not clear, sorry. It's the net. Anyway, maybe you can write it in the chat box. Right? You can write it in the chat box, Manjula.
Yutika, can I just add a few words to what Manjula has been saying?
Yeah. Sure.
The time she spent in Bengal during the Bengal famine, and as she said, she started the Save the Children organization. And it is in our records that a portion of Swaraj Bhavan was handed over to AIWC for starting a children's home, particularly for orphans of the Bengal famine. And Vijaylakshmi ji did that, and that children's home is still functioning there, though the connection with AIWC is no longer there. At some point, like so many other organizations that AIWC founded, it has broken away from AIWC, but that is still there as a monument to the tremendous work that Mrs. Pandit had done during that time, during the time of the Bengal famine, especially for the children. I think that also should be recorded in our history. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Thank you for pointing it out, Ushaji. That is really amazing. That's a good one, and I think now it's been recorded that. But it's also state that why we keep on disconnecting from these places which AIWC originally had. That makes us ponder over what we should be doing in future, not doing. That is one thing. Anyway, I think now we can close the program.
Yes.
With your permission, Sheilaji.
Let us go in for formal vote of thanks.
Yes, I would request Supriya Bhalerao, our Joint Secretary, to kindly give the vote of thanks to the dignitaries and to everyone present. Thank you, Supriya.
Thank you, Yutika. This is Supriya Bhalerao, Joint Secretary of AIWC, delivering the formal vote of thanks for today's webinar. I thank the President, Mrs. Sheila Kakade, for this great initiative of presenting the past presidents of AIWC which our members are really and thoroughly enjoying, to know about their past presidents' personal as well as work life. And I also want to thank Sheila ji to give the detailed account of AIWC's rich legacy, heritage, and the present work also. I thank the Secretary General, Mrs. Kuljit Kaur, and Treasurer, Mrs. Rehana Begum, for their constant support to this program. I'm really honored to thank today's eminent speakers. Professor Kamlesh Mohan, the author of the book on Mrs. Rameshwari Nehru, the professor with a highly rich profile, and a beautiful book she has written on our past president. Thank you, Kamlesh ji, for giving your time and sharing all the information about our 15th president, Mrs. Nehru, and the account of Indian women's movement in that time. I thank you, Mr. Ashok Nehru, the grandson of our past president, Mrs. Rameshwari Nehru, for being with us and giving your time and sharing your experiences on Rameshwari ji in a very casual manner, which we love to hear. Professor Neera Mishra, I thank you, the founder and chairperson of Draupadi Dream Trust, for generating that interesting conversation with Mr. Nehru. We all liked to hear about all that. We are very, now I have to thank the granddaughter of our 16th president, Mrs. Vijaylakshmi Pandit, Mrs. Gita Segal.
Nice.
Can you hear me?
Kuljit.
Can you hear me? There's
Yes,
some disturbance.
Yes, it's perfectly fine.
So let me thank Ms. Gita Segal, who is actually the granddaughter of our 16th president, Mrs. Vijaylakshmi Pandit, for being with us today. And it was lovely hearing you in that video talking about your experiences of your grandmother. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Karan Singh, the former head of JK State, Jammu and Kashmir State, MP, ambassador, and scholar, talking to us in a video clip, sharing his experiences about Mrs. Vijaylakshmi Pandit. I have now want to thank Mrs. Sudha Acharya and her daughter Navina, who are the AIWC's permanent representatives in the UN, for making all the material like photographs, videos, speeches available on Vijaylakshmi Pandit. Now it's time to thank our members, Mrs. Shweta Rai Talwar, who's the Assistant Secretary of AIWC, and Mrs. Chitra Sarkar, who's the member in charge of Roshani, for putting in a great effort to do this vast research on both the presidents and arranging and communicating with the eminent speakers and putting their presentations, beautiful, excellent presentations together. I now thank our patrons, Mrs. Beena Jain and Mrs. Veena Kohli, for attending this webinar. I also thank all the vice presidents present here and the zonal organizers and the member in charges and all the SCMs for being today here with us. All the guests who have attended, I have to thank you all. I could see many of them from Delhi and the other places. Thank you all for being with us. And now I thank Yutika, last but not the least, for presenting the program very well. Thank you, Yutika. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. Biggest thanks goes to you for the lovely yellow colored
Supriya, thank yourself also.
Yeah.
Thank you. I thank everybody from Yutika to Supriya to Chitra and Shweta and all my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Namaskar,
Sheila
everyone.
ji. Namaste.
So next in line would be our next president, Srimati Kamla Devi. Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay.
On 27th.
Yeah, on 27th of this month. See you again.
It's me, ma'am.
Very nice meeting, very informative.
Yeah. Thank you, Kripaji.
How
Thank you,
beautiful. It's me, ma'am.
Thank you. See you next time, Kripaji. On
Yes.
screen.
Yes,
When is
very soon.
Be together.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
When is
Okay.
Bye. Which date is, ma'am?
27th.
27. Thank you, ma'am. At what time?
Same
2:30.
Same
2:30. 2:30.
Okay, ma'am. I am always ready for this. Today's explanation was really beautiful with all pictures and demonstration was really good.
Now
Really, yes.
I see people are looking forward to this program, Sheilaji. That's such a great, this is the, you know, indication of success of this program.
Yes, yes.
It's beautiful program. Nice
Takes
it
us
was.
to
That was what you told us.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Namaskar.
thank you all members.
Close the program. Thank you.
Namaskar. Okay. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.